Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you have any technical difficulties, you can send Eleanor a message on Q&A. And my colleague Joe Klowski is here as well, and he's going to be available during the questions at the end to pitch in and help me if I need any assistance, which is pretty likely, I would say. So let's see here. So hopefully y'all can see that. All right, so thank you all very much for joining us for the annual Kestrel Research Update. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the Clifton Institute. Then I'll talk about Kestrel basics, then habitat selection through the season, vegetation height and density, prey abundance, clutch reduction, and diet. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge my co-PIs, Joe Klowski, who's on the call tonight. He works at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and he's leading this project. And Alan Williams is our other co-PI who has been working with us in all aspects of this project since 2021. Our project team in 2023, we had 5 fantastic research techs: Kaylin Wolfer, Sophie Vasquez, Kristen Weil, Megan Limo, and Sydney Jackson. And we also have fantastic collaborators and volunteers and students. So Mike DeLillo, Ray Mandarino, Josh Rector, Jerry Bedrecki, Sophie Moreno, Maggie Grady, Sydney Hauk, Mark Kettner, Blair Ivanko, and Sarah Lowry. So as you can see, it's a huge team of people working on this project, and we are coming at it from lots of different angles. And I'm really lucky to be working with all these people. And one of my jobs is pulling together all of their hard work to give an annual update like this on our results. So the Clifton Institute, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have 8 full-time staff. We're funded by individual donations and foundation grants. And our 3 program areas are education, restoration, and research. We're located about an hour west of Washington, D.C. in Fauquier County. And to talk briefly about some of our other research projects, for several years now, we've been studying grasses to learn what kinds of plants grow there, what their conservation status is, and then we use those results to inform restoration projects and wildflower meadow planting. We're also working on the restoration of forest understories. We're comparing the effects of prescribed burns and deer exposures at restoring wildflowers and forest understories. And we started a collaborative project on box turtles. We want to know why box turtles are declining. And in particular, we want to be able to give landowners advice on when they should mow their fields to avoid killing them. I hope that our projects, we try to answer basic ecological questions, but all of our projects are very applied, and we always want to have an outcome that gives advice to landowners on how to manage their land. So to Kestrel basics, so American Kestrel is the smallest falcon. It weighs about the same as a deck of cards. It's a predator of big open fields, and it's a charismatic umbrella species that we hope that if we get people behind Kestrel conservation, they'll support grassland conservation in general to help lots of different species. So female American kestrels are rufous and barred all over, while males have blue-gray wings and a rufous tail with a black subterminal band. Kestrels nest in natural cavities or nest boxes. They have a clutch size of 5, and this clutch has 1 starling egg. And their incubation and nestling periods each last about a month, and then the fledglings are dependent on the adults for 2 weeks after they fledge. The kestrel lifespan is around 3 years, with a maximum of 11 years, so they're don't live for very long. And then to look at the population trends, though, here we're looking at data from the North American Breeding Bird Survey from 1966 to 2014. And the areas that are red had declining kestrel populations during that period. Orange had no significant trend, and green, only 2 areas had increasing kestrel population during that period. And then if we zoom into area 29, that's the Piedmont, that's where we are, and we can see a 73% decline of kestrels from 1966 to 2014. So pretty serious decline. Then if we look at more recent data, this is eBird data from 2012 to 2022 during the breeding season. And the color of the dots tell you if it's declining or increasing. Almost all of these are red, so that means they're declining. The size of the dots tells you how abundant kestrels are in that area. And so this map is showing us that it's pretty different from the last map. It's showing us that the decline recently has been most severe in the west, although the situation in the east is not very good either. And so if we zoom into the mid-Atlantic, we see that you're not able to estimate a trend with certainty for a lot of the areas, but if you are able to, they're declining. So there are a lot of potential reasons for the decline in kestrels, such as loss of agricultural land and urbanization, clean farming and the elimination of hedgerows, use of insecticides or rodenticides, predation by Cooper's hawks, which have increased over time, competition with starlings for nest sites, and low nestling and fledgling survival. And through our research, we are trying to look at several of these hypotheses. So what's known about the kestrel habitat requirements so far? They are found in big open fields with relatively short vegetation, and they like big contiguous chunks of grasslands. But other than that, their detailed habitat requirements are poorly known. So we have been studying kestrels in the 4 major agricultural habitats of the mid-Atlantic, and that's fescue cattle pastures, fescue and orchard grass hayfields, row crops, which are mostly corn and millet in our area, and meadows, which are wildflowers, native grasses, or unmowed fescue fields. So tonight I'm going to be asking 5 questions. The first is, which habitats are selected at different times of the year? Secondly, how are vegetation height and density related to habitat selection? Third, how does kestrel prey abundance vary across habitats? How common is clutch reduction, such as failure to hatch or low nestling survival in our population? And finally, what are kestrels feeding their babies? So first, for habitat selection. So since 2021, we've been catching kestrels and attaching GPS transmitters to them to find out what kinds of habitats they're using. And we do this by catching them in the nest box and then using a backpack harness to attach the transmitter. And the way these transmitters work, they're very lightweight, and they record the locations on the unit. And so the only way we can get the data is by downloading it when we're within about a quarter mile of the bird. And this works really well for these birds that have territories around here. And we've been lucky to get several birds that return and breed here again, and we get a whole motherload of data from them. And here we are. It's a really impressive amount of data that we've gotten from these birds. Each line of dots is an individual kestrel, and the red dots are females and the green dots are males. You can see that in 2021 we were only males the following year, and last year we were focusing on tagging pairs, males and females. And so it's pretty amazing that we have so much data for these birds, some of them pretty much all the way from the beginning to the end of the study. We've tagged 61 birds now, and we have an average of about 1,700 locations per bird and a maximum of around 8,000 locations. So this just shows the power of the GPS technology that we're using. It would be pretty much impossible to get data like this using radio transmitters. It would take many years to get as much information, and it wouldn't be as accurate. So we're really working on kestrels at an interesting time when the GPS transmitters have become small enough to attach them to kestrels. And we're doing this in Northern Virginia. So this map, the gray dots are showing nest boxes that we're monitoring, and the red dots are showing the nest boxes where we captured and attached transmitters birds. So we're in Fauquier and Rappahannock mainly, and a few in Warren County. And now, together with our many partners, we're monitoring more than 250 nest boxes in Northern Virginia. And if you would like, you can go to our website and you can follow along and see if there's a kestrel in your neighborhood, and you can follow its movements by going to our research page. So I wanted to recap. So I talked about these results last year, but we've now published these. So in 2021, we tagged 17 females with GPS transmitters, and we got some really interesting results. So this map is showing home ranges where each color is showing a different individual female. And so you can see they have pretty tightly packed territories around the Clifton Institute. And they end up being really small. So they're about 80 acres in size, which is close to the smallest that's ever been reported for kestrels. And we also found that they frequently made what we call extraterritorial forays. So they would fly out of their home range and visit an area and then come back to their home range. And then we found that those forays were related to post-breeding territory. So they would go check an area out during the breeding season, and then when the babies were out, they would end up shifting to that area and establishing a new post-breeding territory. And these kinds of movements are totally new for the species. So this is some fundamental information that's helping us learn about how kestrels make their living, which of course will be important for conservation as well in the future. And like I mentioned, we published this paper last year in the Journal of Raptor Research. So there's lots more to explore. This is showing kind of what we're up against, which is really exciting, but also a big challenge. We've got so much data. The top panel is showing points of a male and female pair, and you can see that they're sticking really tight to their territory, and they're apparently getting everything they need from right around the nest spot. In contrast, the lower panel, the male is ranging all over the place. And we have a lot of examples of these interesting differences between the pairs, and we don't yet know why they're behaving so differently. So Wolfer started off as a research tech with us, and now she's doing a master's at Virginia Tech. And this is one of the things she's going to be exploring in her research, trying to understand why we're seeing such radically different behavior among the different pairs. So for habitat selection, we analyze movements in 3 periods. The nestling period, when babies are in the box. The fledgling period, which is from the fledge date until the last observation of a fledgling in the territory. And the post-breeding period, which is after the fledgling stage until September 15th. And we looked at habitat selection. We're looking at it in a number of ways, but right here I'm going to show you a comparison of the habitat where the points, where the birds, their locations are recorded, so where the points are, and comparing that to the habitat proportions within the home range. So here you can see that most of these points are in a pasture, but there are also quite a few in a meadow, kind of obscured by the point there, and several points as well in the forest. And so what we do is we look and see we calculate the proportion of points that are within a particular habitat type. And then we compare that to the proportion of habitats that are available inside the home range. Here it's mostly pasture. And this is what we end up with. So on this graph, we have on the y-axis the selection ratio, and on the x-axis the different period during the breeding season. So we're going to start by looking at the nestling period, and you'll see 4 different colors. Those are the habitat types. So yellow is hay, gray is pasture, green is forest, and orange is meadow. And then the points that are above the dotted line are points that are being selected compared to the home range. Whereas if they're below the dotted line, they're not being selected compared to the habitats available to them in the home range. And then we have error bars and an average for the habitat. So in this case, the hay fields are being significantly not selected. So it's just overlapping the dotted line. I don't know if it's actually above or not, but if it's not significant, it's very close to being significantly not selected. So they really are avoiding hay fields during the next period. And we see in contrast that quite a few birds really like meadows, but it's not significantly different. Then during the fledgling stage, we see that hay fields are not avoided quite as much, and that meadows, there's still quite a few meadows that are being selected, but it's not significantly different from the proportion of habitats that are available to them. Then during the post-breeding period, things get really interesting, and we see that they're really avoiding hay fields, and they're also significantly selecting cattle pastures, and they're really avoiding meadows. So we see some pretty substantial changes here. And of course, the question is, why are they doing that? So to sum up the habitat selection results, first of all, hay fields are the least selected habitat type. Pastures are selected significantly in the season. Meadows tend to be selected early in the season, but it's a weak pattern. But meadows are significantly avoided late in the breeding season. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation and a fairly weak trends that we're seeing. And we're going to be exploring this further with resource selection function modeling. And that will include modeling the distance to nest boxes and distance to perches. That'll help us get a better idea of how they're making their decisions. Okay, so on to vegetation structure. So there are a lot of potential drivers of habitat selection in kestrels. One would be prey abundance. So simply, if there's more food in a particular habitat type, you would expect maybe the kestrel to go there and find the food. But it's probably not that simple because there may be a lot of food, but it could be really could be hard to access or see. So if you've got tall and dense vegetation, that could be behind what we're seeing. Like I mentioned, the proximity to the nest box could be important for determining habitat selection. The kestrels don't want to travel farther away from the nest box than they have to. Human disturbance, if that's really severe, kestrels could be avoiding areas with a lot of human disturbance. Available perches are important for kestrels. They really prefer to be hunting from a perch. They can also hover and catch prey that way, but they prefer to have a perch. So again, that would be important for habitat selection. Competition and predation could also be important. So we might expect them to avoid areas with lots of other kestrels who are competitors. And they might avoid wood lines, for example, where there would be a lot of Cooper's hawks, which are predators. So a lot to analyze there. So related to this, it's unknown how vegetation structure changes during the season in our area. And so it's pretty hard to understand if it's prey abundance or if it's vegetation structure that's driving some of these decisions. But luckily, we had some really hardworking technicians and Joe as well in the summer of 2021. And they went out there and did the hard work to measure the corn as it grew tall, you know, with a lot of people looking on and wondering what in the world they were doing out there. It's pretty hot in a cornfield in August. And they used the Roble pole, modified Roble method to do this. They were measuring maximum vegetation height, and they were measuring vegetation density, which is calculated by the height at which the Roble pole is first visible. And they did this sampling from May to August every 10 days, and they sampled 6 points per field. So for vegetation height, on the y-axis, we have the maximum vegetation height, and on the x, we have the month. And so you can see in pastures, they get significantly shorter as the season progresses. This is presumably because of grazing and some bush hogging. For hay, we also see a significant decrease in vegetation height through the season, obviously because they're cutting hay. For meadows, in contrast, we see a significant increase in vegetation height as the season progresses. For vegetation density, here on the y-axis, we have vegetation density, and on the x, we have the month. We see that vegetation density is constant in pastures. In contrast, vegetation density in hay decreases through the season, and density in meadows increases. So if you think about it for a second, what we would do is connect the habitat selection results that we had. We see that the kestrels are selecting the pastures late in the season, and they're avoiding meadows late in the season. And it seems like the meadows are probably getting too tall and too dense for kestrels late in the season, whereas the pastures are still have suitable vegetation structure in them. But then the big question is, we saw a decrease in vegetation height in pastures and in hay, so they have very similar vegetation structure. So one thing we still need to figure out is why pastures are so much better kestrel habitat than hay fields. That's one thing we're going to be working on. And we're going to be using a variation of resource selection function modeling to formalize this and to see if we can test for a relationship between vegetation structure, habitat type, and habitat selection. Okay, so now on to the topic that's near my heart, abundance. So it's unclear how prey abundance and accessibility are related to habitat selection in our area. And in fact, it hasn't been studied very well anywhere in the world. There's only a couple studies that have looked at this. But we're trying. So last year was a pilot season, and we sampled small mammal abundance, as well as grasshoppers and dragonflies, because these are all thought to be important prey items for kestrels, and the different habitat types to see if prey abundance might be behind some of the habitat selection results that we're observing. But before I go any further, I thought I would give you a little bit of basic information about meadow voles. I've been learning a lot about them lately. I thought we were studying kestrels, but it's actually becoming important that we learn a lot more about their prey, because I think the meadow voles are going to be driving a lot of what we're seeing. We'll see. And I've been calling them squid of the prairie. So if you know much about marine biology, squid, their purpose in the ocean is to be eaten. They're the perfect food, and everything in the ocean eats squid. And voles are basically the same in the grassland. So they are chunky. They're bigger than other small mammals in our area, so they're really good food. They have a lot of squabbles, make a lot of noise, so they're relatively easy to detect. They don't hibernate, so they're available as food items year-round. They're active day and night, so both diurnal and nocturnal raptors can eat them. And they tend to be really common, with an average density of 60 voles per acre. Ann Fitzpatrick in 2003 did some live trapping in our area, and she found that 92% of small mammals and grasslands in our area are meadow voles. So clearly, they are a really important prey source for raptors in the Mid-Atlantic. But we have to go to Switzerland to see the kind of study that I'm looking for. And so what's happening there is that there are incentive programs to leave tall wildflower strips next to agricultural fields. And so the question is, how do these agricultural strips compare to how do these wildflower strips compare to the adjacent agricultural fields in terms of prey abundance? And they've looked into this in Switzerland and found a lot more voles in the dense and tall wildflower strips compared to the adjacent agricultural fields. So you might expect that the raptors would do all of their hunting in the tall wildflower strips, because that's what the food is. But in fact, when they tag the common kestrels and the long-eared owls there in Switzerland, they find that they're hunting almost exclusively in short grass. So they apparently are unable to catch the prey in the tall wildflower strips. And what the authors conclude is that the tall vegetation is probably serving as an important prey source for raptors. And the raptors tend to hunt along the edges of the tall vegetation and grab the food, grab the voles as they venture out into the shorter grass next to the wildflower strips. We look at literature on grasshoppers and vegetation structure, and the best studies are also from Europe. So in this figure on the y-axis is abundance, and the three different colored bars are three species of grasshoppers. And here we're seeing that the intermediate vegetation height is what's selected by grasshoppers in England. So 4 to 8 inches is the preferred vegetation height for grasshoppers in England. Pretty interesting. different from the voles. And another study, this one is from Germany. This is looking at, again, grasshopper abundance on the y-axis, vegetation density this time instead of height on the x-axis. And we see that as the vegetation becomes more dense, there are fewer grasshoppers. So this is the opposite of what was found with the voles. And then if we come much closer to home, there is one study that's really cool that was done. It was done, well, by Carrie Fitzpatrick. This was her PhD thesis from the University of Maryland, and she defended her thesis in 2003. She established experimental plots in meadows at 5 sites in Maryland and Virginia. And the Virginia site is at Dulles Airport. And what she did was set up an experiment where she varied the height at which the plots were mowed and also the frequency at which they were mowed. She then set up fancy perches in them that recorded an observation every time a bird heavier than 95 grams landed on. So she was able to measure the frequency at which raptors were using her different experimental plots by doing this. And 2/3 of the raptors that were sitting on the perches were kestrels. And she found a pretty strong pattern that the raptors really preferred the fields that were the shortest and the fields that were getting mowed the most frequently. So this, is in accord with what we saw in Switzerland. Fitzpatrick also did prey abundance sampling, so she sampled mammals with live traps and grasshoppers with transects to see if there was a relationship between prey abundance and habitat selection. And so here are her vole results. So on the y-axis are voles per acre, and on the x-axis are the number of times a field was mowed. And we have 3 vegetation heights. So the tallest is when it's cut at a foot, the middle is when it's cut at 8 inches, and the bottom is cut at 4 inches. And so what we see here is that compared to the initial situation, which was the control, where you had 140 voles per acre, when you cut the field once down to 4 inches, you go down to 20 voles per acre. So the drastic drop in the number of voles if you cut it really short, and not as drastic for the other height. Then when you mow the field 3 times, we see significant decreases in all 3, regardless of the height, and there are basically no voles left in the shortest treatment. And then by the time you cut it 6 times, they've all really dropped. So pretty interesting. But her grasshopper data showed the opposite trend, similar kind of to what we saw in the European studies. So on the y-axis is the abundance of grasshoppers, and on the x-axis is vegetation height. So we see that, according to her data at least, that the grasshoppers prefer to be in short vegetation. And we see the same pattern with density. So the grasshoppers prefer vegetation that is not very easy. So dragonflies, there are no previous studies that I could find on the effects of vegetation structure on dragonfly abundance out in dry fields. They study wetlands and all that, but nobody has really looked at vegetation structure in dragonflies. And we don't necessarily have a hypothesis on which way it will go, and we don't really care that much. But what we do care about is if one of our habitat types is really full of dragonflies compared to another habitat type. And maybe that's why kestrels are selecting this habitat. So that was a lot of literature on prey abundance. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. So to summarize that before we move on with our methods, voles are probably most abundant in tall and dense vegetation. And grasshoppers are probably showing the opposite, found mostly in short and less dense vegetation. But the grasshoppers, there's more uncertainty because of the methods used in those studies. And I could go into those details later if y'all are interested. And we probably wouldn't hypothesize any effect of vegetation structure on dragonflies. Okay, now on to our methods. So we use track pads to quantify vole abundance. And these track pads are sections of plastic rain gutters that have been cut in half. And in the middle, we put a piece of paper and a bait ball of peanut butter and oats. And on the ends, we have ink pads, and you can see all the cute little bowl footprints in the middle. And so we set out a whole bunch of these arrays and use them to quantify bowl abundance by looking at the footprint. And this is a lot easier to do compared to live trapping, and you don't have to kill any bulls, you don't have to get a bunch of animal care permits. And it turns out that the results are highly correlated with results from using live trapping, the more labor-intensive method. But it's still a whole bunch of work, and so here's Maggie, for example, preparing a whole bunch of bait balls for the arrays. And so we set these up in arrays of 4x3 track pads, and they were each separated from each other by 5 meters. And we had 2 vegetation sampling points in each array, shown by the red circle. And we ran these track pads only during the daylight hours for 5 days, from May to August. We sampled 52 fields for a total of 62 arrays in Fauquier and Rappahannock. For grasshoppers and dragonflies, we simply walked a 100-meter-long transect that was 5 meters wide on each side. And we sampled vegetation height and structure at 3 points along the transect. And we ended up doing 231 transects during the pilot season. Not bad for a pilot season. So for mammals, unfortunately, about a third of our arrays were zeros. So we set out these track pads, and we ended up not getting any footprints on about a third of the ones we set out. So this was disappointing. It limits our ability to analyze the data. But looking at what we've got, on the y-axis, we have the mammal abundance, and on the x-axis, we have the different habitat types. And we see no difference between the habitat types for bull abundance. For grasshoppers, similarly, there is no clear difference between the habitat types. There's a suggestion that pasture might have had more grasshoppers, but we need to get more data. For dragonflies, there's also no difference between the different habitat types for dragonflies. For vegetation structure and prey abundance, we found one significant relationship, and that is that as the vegetation gets taller, there are more voles. So this is in accordance with the previous studies. It's not the strongest pattern, but it seems to be, it is statistically significant, and we'll see if it holds up next year when we get more data. But we found no other relationships between vegetation structure and prey. Obvious in prey abundance among the habitat types, more mammals and taller vegetation. The dragonfly transect worked really well, so we got a lot of dragonfly detections, and we're going to keep using that method this year. But as I pointed out, the mammals were really disappointing, so we're going to be running them for 24 hours. Like I mentioned earlier, voles are active day and night. The reason we ran them during the day is because that's when kestrels are hunting, so we thought that would be the fairest way of doing it. But now we're going to run them for 24 hours because the goal is simply to sample the vole abundance. We're also going to double the number of arrays. So we're going to have our number of track pads. So we're going to have 24 track pads in each array. And the goal is really to boost our sample out there to find out how many voles there are in the different habitats. And it may have looked like Patrick has already done all this for us, but actually there's some significant ways we're going to improve or expand what she did. So one thing is that her prey abundance sampling was all done in October, whereas her data on the raptors and the mowing treatments were all done in the summer. So there's a real mismatch there. In addition, all of her sampling was done in meadows, and so we're obviously interested in comparing the different habitat types. So we're going to be expanding on her work in those 2 major ways. Okay, now on to clutch reduction. So the traditional way of monitoring kestrels is by looking in the box and seeing what's happening in there. And the goal is to try to check it early during the nesting bout to see what the clutch size is, and then to check it as late as you can and see how successful they were. Obviously, this has led to this traditional monitoring has created amazing data sets on how kestrels are doing across North America. But if you could get a camera in there, it would really improve things because you would be able to monitor the entire period without interruption and see exactly what happens to all the babies, see what happens with predation, which eggs hatch, which eggs don't, which eggs are eaten by the adults. There's a lot of things that are happening in that box that we are going to be able to capture with cameras. And so Alan Williams has been working with these cameras for years now, and he's developed these techniques. And so he's learned how to set up these a little house on top of the Kestrel box for the camera, and they're connected up through the cell network, and we're able to record what's happening in the boxes with a solar-powered camera that way. And we were lucky to receive funding to really ramp up our camera network, and this was actually Dick Raines' idea, and it was a really good idea because we ended up, as you'll see, we're learning a whole lot from all these cameras. And together with our partners, we now have 59 cameras that ran in 2023. So we are getting a lot of good data. And so clutch reduction is one of the things that we're looking at with the cameras, and clutch reduction could be contributing to the decline. So, simply if you lay 5 eggs, but you're only fledging 2 babies, that could be a problem. And like I said, the traditional monitoring has led to a lot of good information on what's happening in these Kestrel boxes. And if you look at all the studies that are available, which is more than 1,000 nests from 8 states, the initial clutch size of kestrels in North America averages 4.7 eggs. And the number of fledglings is only 3.1. So that's a significant drop that we're seeing in the literature. And now for the fun part, we watch a couple of videos to see what's happening in these boxes. That's a skink. And that's a baby bird being brought in. And finally, tiger swallowtail. Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about this one. As probably a lot of y'all know, I really like insects as well, but I guess the kestrels, we got to eat something. Okay, and for our clutch reduction results, so like I said, we had a lot of cameras out last year, and we documented 46 nesting attempts in camera boxes. And out of those, the average clutch size was 4.8, which is right in line with previous studies. And we also had significant clutch reduction. So we ended up fledging an average of 3.3 chicks out of those boxes. So 26 of the 46 nests, that's 55%, had some kind of clutch reduction, excluding predation. And this was caused by unhatched or infertile eggs, abandoned nests, and nestling starvation. We also had 3 predation events, 2 woodpeckers and a snake. The snake got past the predator guard. And this actually turned out to be the first time that woodpeckers have been documented as predators for kestrel. So this is a very naughty red-bellied woodpecker. Okay, so to sum up the results on clutch reduction, the cameras are producing a lot of detailed data that we can use for a variety of research questions. The cameras are also great for engaging the public. Every landowner out there would like to have a camera to see what's happening in that box. And that's a way of spreading the word about kestrels and getting other people interested in their conservation. Traditional monitoring is still really important. One thing I would like to do, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this, but it would be great to see what the nestling quality is that is being produced. And so you can measure the growth and development of nestlings and see how they're doing and you can do that. Related to that, we saw substantial clutch reduction, and you might think that's really bad because you start with 5, but you end up with only 3 babies. But actually, I looked into the literature, and there's a fair number of studies on raptors that have found that actually, if you reduce the clutch state from 5 down to 3, usually the adults keep bringing in the same amount of food, and so the remaining 3 babies end up really fat and strong and likely to survive. And so this is actually is potentially an evolutionary strategy where you can lay 5 eggs and you're going to have a runt, and it's okay if the runt dies because you're going to end up with stronger babies. So it's an interesting thing that we're going to be exploring and looking to see if there's a relationship between habitat and clutch reduction. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with diet. So kestrels eat everything from ladybugs all the way up to young rabbits. They are opportunistic feeders. But if you look, there's a lot of studies that have been done out there, and insects are about 3/4 of the diet on average, followed by mammals, and then followed by birds. And a tiny fraction are reptiles. But as you might expect, over such a big area, there's a lot of variation, and mammals can be as much as about half of the diet. There's one study in Texas that was where the diet was 75% lizard, and the highest number I could find for birds was 21% birds in Ontario. We're using cameras, obviously, but we're also looking at nest box content. So raptors are really messy. They're not like passerines, like bluebirds are neat and tidy. The bluebird will go in there and grab the fecal sac, and they're able to remove all the nestling poop from the nest. Not the case with raptors. They're just pooping in there, and they're also coughing up pellets that are full of undigested prey parts. So it's a pretty gross situation in these raptor boxes, but it's also a gold mine of information that we can collect and learn about their diet. And of course, different data sources have different biases. The cameras are going to record more prey deliveries than we get from the nest box content, but we're going to be able to better identify small stuff like insects by looking at the prey remains in the box. So here's Mark. He's totally psyched to be watching these Kestrel videos. He's normally our box turtle technician, but now he's volunteering and helping us in the off season with the Kestrels. And he and Blair have now watched a lot of videos of 5 boxes during the 3rd week of the nestling period. And we had another Smithsonian Mason School of Conservation student, Sydney Hauk, and she dug through the contents of 29 nest boxes. And for the camera results, so like I said, it's only 5 boxes, but it's really tantalizing. So here we're looking at the proportion of different prey types in those 5 boxes. The brown bars are mammals, the green are insects, the teal are herps, that's reptiles and amphibians. So it's only 5, but we're seeing a bunch of variations. Some of them are eating a whole bunch of mammals, 3 of them are eating a whole bunch of insects. So it'll be really exciting to see as we get more of these videos watched and we collect this kind of data. We're going to learn a lot. For the nest box content, we're also getting a lot of interesting results. Those are pretty much all beetle legs up in the top left from the boxes. And then in the bottom right, we've got cicadas and grasshopper wings. And you may think it would be impossible, but we're able to actually identify quite a few of those remains. And we found a whole bunch of June bugs and Carolina grasshoppers, as well as cicadas. Another cool thing we found was rainbow scarab dung beetles and 2 different kinds of carrion beetles in the box. And so we think, it's so gross in those boxes that it's attracting these carrion beetles and dung beetles to lay eggs in there. And then the baby kestrels or the adult kestrels end up picking off the adult beetles when they're in there. And this is the first time that carrion beetles have been reported as dietary items for kestrels. For mammals, we found meadow vole remains and also short-tailed shrew remains. And when you see, when you're watching the videos, sometimes it's really it can be hard to distinguish these two because they both have short tails. You can, if you get a really nice shot, you can tell based on the color and the structure of the fur. But in the box, it's easy. If you have the skull, no problem to distinguish them. And so as we get more data from the nest box contents, we're going to be able to validate the camera data. For birds, cardinals, song sparrows, catbirds, and bluebirds as prey items in the boxes. And we've also found crawfish in there, which is another first for Kestrel. And when you look at it by weight, we see that there's a lot of insects, birds, and mammals, not that many reptiles. And our next task is going to be estimating the number of individuals of these different kinds of prey. So to wrap up diet, insects, mammals, birds, and lizards are all important components of the diet in our area. The camera data are providing a more complete picture, but the contents are giving complementary data. And we're just getting started, especially with the camera footage, so definitely check in next year for an update on this. It should be really interesting. And we are going to be connecting the camera data with movement data and habitat to see if we can understand see if we can understand the relationship between different habitats that are available to the birds and what they're bringing back as food. Okay, so to wrap it all up, our first research question was which habitats are selected at different times of year. Pastures are selected late in the year, meadows early in the year, although that's a weak pattern, and hayfields are the least preferred habitat. How are vegetation height and density related to that? Well, meadows get taller and denser as the season progresses, and that seems to be why the kestrels are avoiding those habitats late in the season. But then the mystery is that the structure of pastures and hayfields are really similar, but we're seeing really different amounts of use of those habitats. So that's one thing we're going to be focusing on trying to understand. Thirdly, how does kestrel prey abundance vary across habitats? Well, it doesn't, at least not yet, according to our data. We'll find out if that changes as we get more. But we do see that as the grass is taller, there are more voles. So that's an interesting tidbit. Fourth, how common is clutch reduction in our population? Really common, but if you end up fledging babies that are going to survive, have a better chance of surviving, then maybe it's not a problem. That's something we also need to keep exploring. And finally, what are kestrels feeding nestlings in our area? Insects, mammals, and birds. Stay tuned on that. So what can you do to help kestrels? First of all, you can mow your fields annually in February. That leaves a lot of standing vegetation during the winter for all sorts of other animals. And if you have tall fields, you can mow extra wide trails so that kestrels can hunt there. Just be careful about killing box turtles when you're doing it. You can install and maintain nest boxes, and you can ask your neighbors as well. You can install perches. So like I mentioned, perches are important for kestrels to be able to hunt. And we dig holes here at Clifton and install dead trees. That's the Bruce Jones method. Works really well. It's also a good idea if you have enough land to maintain fields of different heights to support different species, so tall grass species and short grass species. And of course, you want to minimize the use of insecticides and rodenticides. If you'd like to buy a nest box at the moment, a good place to get them is woodducknestboxes.com. This guy, Greg, is making really nice cedar boxes in Michigan, and he's making plenty of quantities. Coat size has been sold out lately. And if you like to build your own box, you can follow Art Gingert's design. That's a really good design, and we have the plans for that on our website. We also have instructions on how to install the nest box, including the predator guard, which is really important. And before I close, just again, a thanks to the team. It's really a pleasure to work with all of these folks. And you can see it's a lot of people behind all the results that I've presented. In addition to the paid staff, we have a great network of past and current volunteers and collaborators and interns. Also like to thank the landowners who allowed research on their land, Eleanor for help with statistics, landowners with nest boxes on their land. Major funding comes from the Rains Family Fund, the Band Foundation, and Nick Lapham. Without that support, we would not be able to do this work. The Virginia Society of Ornithology, Washington Biologist Field Club, Peregrine Fund, Janine Mosley and Eldon Farm also provided. Thank you very much.
Okay, Bert, I think you can go ahead and go through the questions, but maybe read the questions out loud first for the sake of the recording. Or I can do.
Okay, here we go. And Joe, feel free to jump in.
And I would start with Tara's question about kestrels remaining in the home range.
Maybe I'm not seeing that. Why don't you? Could you do that now?
Okay, so we have a question. Do kestrels generally remain in the same home range throughout their lives? How far do the fledglings disperse when they leave the nest?
Well, we have a little bit of data on that from radio tagged fledglings. We miles. And then we also have some data from banding. So Alan and October and other colleagues have been banding a lot of babies, and we're getting some interesting tidbits. They tend to, it seems like, move around Northern Virginia. They don't necessarily stick to the same neighborhood, but they might be found 20 miles away nesting.
And maybe you wanted to speak to the long range migrations and that they return to the same spot year after year.
Yeah, so for long range movements, we have documented some movements down to South Carolina and Georgia, and they ended up coming and breeding right back here. And we don't know yet, there's not enough information, but it seems like our population is about half resident and half migratory. So, and it depends, at least from the west, there's just some studies that have found that in a more severe winter, more to
Okay, what model?
I think, Eleanor, I think Tara also asked about the home range, whether they remain in the same home range throughout their lives, which is a good question. We've been tracking a few birds long enough to see, and we do have banded birds without the tracking units as well that we recapture in future years. So we definitely see kind of all variation there. Some birds that year after year have been in the same home range. We see birds that shift to the adjacent home range next door, probably because they're familiar with that. But we have also had birds popping up in our study area, but in completely different nest boxes. That's less common though. But we haven't, I think we actually have, based on banding data, a couple examples of birds that have been in the same nest box for, maybe Alan can remind me, but I think we have one that was in the same nest box for like 7 or 8 years in a row. So it definitely does happen that they just settle into their favorite spot.
Awesome. Okay, what model GPS transmitters were you all using?
It was TechnoSmart Gypsy, and now it's Milsar Nano. You go for it, Joe.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, the first company we used is TechnoSmart, but in the end, they were using technology from this other company called Milsar, which I believe are based in Romania. And they've been working quite well. So Milsar is the brand. I think it's called the NanoTag. It's basically their smallest solar GPS unit. And they cost about $1,200 a piece, the units.
I was going to add that if you're curious for, maybe putting one on your dog or for fun, this is not the model that you're interested in, but we need them small for the birds, so that comes at a price. Okay, how do researchers determine the abundance or number of individual mammals from the track pads? In other words, how do you know that you're not just getting one mammal running back and forth?
Yeah, so, well, for one thing, it is possible to identify the species if you're really good at it, and you can work at that. You can create a reference collection of different footprints, and you can try to identify the different species that you've got. But that's also error prone. And so the safest thing to do is to say presence or absence. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to say footprints or no footprints. That's it.
Okay, are there local advocates working on education and outreach about the use of rodenticides?
Gosh, that's a great one. I don't know. That would be good.
Okay, well, that's all the questions. Any, yeah, we'll stay around for a couple more minutes if anyone else has any other questions, but otherwise, Bert.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Joe.